Thanks, Marco, for that. I think that was a great segue for us to get into Bitcoin in general and talk about a little bit more about what Ola's doing and what's going on in Bitcoin in this neck of the woods. So without further ado, I'm Faris Ghandour, partner at Wamda Capital. I've been doing this for about 3 years, so very new to the venture investment scene. We invest in various types of technology companies in the MENA region. One of our investments is BitOasis. We're very bullish on fintech. Haven't seen much by way of pipeline in terms of maturity, but I think we'll get there. It's just, we need to be a little bit more patient with fintech. BitOasis is one of the stars in our portfolio, so it's a pleasure to be talking to you, Ola. Ola Doudin is the founder and CEO of BitOasis, the largest and probably only Bitcoin wallet and exchange in the MENA region. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. That's the second time I attend the event, the World Blockchain Forum. And Mo, I'd like to congratulate you on the great event. So my name is Ola, as Faris mentioned. I'm co-founder and CEO of BitOasis. We're the first and only digital currency exchange and wallet provider based in Dubai and focused on the Middle East and North Africa region. The way we think about it is that digital currencies, Bitcoin and blockchain technology will fundamentally transform how we transact. Specifically when it comes to financial services and payments. But in order to get to that transformation or to drive that transformation, you definitely need the on-ramps and the off-ramps. So you need the tools that allow people, consumers and the mainstream to securely and easily transact using Bitcoin in that case, or blockchain technology. So that's what we set out to do when we started in early 2015. So we built the first Bitcoin exchange here in UAE that serves GCC customers. So we're present across the GCC, and that's our main market today. We also have our multi-sig wallets or secure wallets for consumers to transact. And recently we've released our APIs as well to enable people to build applications on top of our infrastructure. So that's what we are focused on at this stage, building the liquidity in our market, becoming the infrastructure layer that enable future applications built on digital currency and cryptocurrencies.
Nice. So let's take a step back first and talk about some of the stuff we've been reading about in the news lately, past couple of years, maybe more so last year, I'd say, about Bitcoin being somewhat of a failure. And it's mostly from Western journalists who were kind of hoping for a use case to come out a lot sooner than maybe they're seeing. Can we debunk that real quick?
Sure, I'll give you my own perspective on that, but I think it's a sentiment shared across the whole ecosystem. Specifically cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. I think a lot of that rhetoric and reporting is exaggerated, but also I think we need to have realistic expectations on how new technologies get adopted. So every new technology obviously gets kind of released to the masses, and people start using it and building applications on it, but also people tag unrealistic expectations to that technology and how it could transform how we do work in such a short time span. So if you look at the Gartner hype cycle, obviously you've kind of have like the first segment where you've got the early adopters, and then you've got sort of the hype, which is kind of the peak, and then you've got the crash where people start saying that, well, it did not fulfill its potential. And Bitcoin has gone through that. I think the past couple of years where you've had people realizing failed, unrealistic expectations, but that doesn't mean that the technology has been growing, or the adoption of technology has been growing at every metric. So I think since 2015, you've got 300% growth in transactional volume on the blockchain network, on the Bitcoin blockchain network. You've had some same growth as well in terms of number of new wallets being created on the network. Bitcoin price has increased by 100% over 2016. And also the hash rate, which is the security of the technology or the blockchain network, has been consistently growing ever since the technology has been in use. So a lot of that has been exaggerated, but also it's because people have tagged unrealistic expectations to what Bitcoin can do in such a short-term period of time. I think the same sentiment is probably now growing among enterprise blockchain applications crowd, where a lot of people have also had unrealistic expectations of how fast this technology would be adopted or how it would change how banks work. But this is very, very normal. You also see it in other technologies such as AI, big data. But it's a normal progression that technologies have to go through up until you get to the real applications where people will be using that technology in everyday use or once it breaks into the mainstream.
Okay, that's a good segue into the next question I had for you, which is around Bitcoin as an infrastructure rather than Bitcoin as a tool or a particular use case, just yet, right? So let's talk about Bitcoin in that light. Why is it you think that people have been too focused on a use case rather than Bitcoin as an infrastructure? So as an example that's relatable to all, when the internet first came out, no one was saying, oh, where's email? Why isn't everyone using email yet? Oh, internet is a failure. But then, at the same time, you weren't really asking people to invest in email, you're asking people to invest in the internet as an infrastructure. Is this a similar situation with Bitcoin? Should we really be focusing on Bitcoin as infrastructure and then let the use cases eventually come up?
Yeah, one thing to note, obviously, is, and it goes back to the kind of Gartner hype cycle. When you've got new transformational technologies introduced to the masses, those are not technologies that will take 3 to 5 years to break to the mainstream. Those are technologies that will perhaps take decades. So you can build the infrastructure or you build those layers or protocols, etc., that will enable mainstream users to use that technology. An email is an example. The World Wide Web, the browser was another example. When the internet first started, 1995, even probably before that, it was a information superhighway. So it was a protocol to enable you to share data information. But it was mostly used by geeks, by computer scientists, but people who actually understood how to connect to the internet and use it. But you didn't have the tools that we had today, such as Gmail, Google Apps, even messaging apps that we have today. It took 25 years or more to get to that stage where someone will be setting up a WhatsApp message, or my mom actually using WhatsApp, but she didn't really use the internet how it was in 1995. It was just too hard for her to use it at that point, for example. So such technologies like the internet, like Bitcoin, digital currencies, blockchain, will take some time to get to break into the mainstream because you need to build the infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning an easy way for people to connect to this technology and transact without going through the hassle that people are going through now to buy Bitcoin, for example, to break into mainstream applications, new payment applications, new financial services, a new way for us to raise funds and crowdfund, etc. So the point is that when it comes to digital currencies, it's not something that will happen overnight. You need today the liquidity, the exchanges that build the on-ramps and the off-ramps for people to easily connect and disconnect from the Bitcoin network or using blockchain technology. You need secure methods of storage, such as wallets, payment processors that will connect to merchants. But interestingly as well, which is what we've been seeing in 2016, people building protocols on top of Bitcoin's blockchain. So you've got startups such as Lightning. They're building Lightning Network to enable you to transact faster and easier on the Bitcoin network. So rather than waiting 10 minutes for a confirmation time on your transactions, you're using Lightning Network, which is instant transactions. You've got, I think, startups such as RSK, they're in the crowd here, building smart contracts on top of Bitcoin protocol. So there's all these efforts that need to take place, which has already been happening, and there's great momentum in the ecosystem, to enable other developers to build payment applications that will break into the mainstream.
We are a little bit short on time. I'm getting the signal here, so it's really important for me to talk about beyond Bitcoin and blockchain, about fintech, building a fintech company in the emerging markets, in the markets that we're in the fragmented markets that we're a part of. Can you just quickly map out the fintech ecosystem out here in the Middle East and North Africa, where you see it and where you see yourself plugging in, and what is it like for you to build a company in fintech?
Yeah, we'll need more than a couple of minutes to cover that. I think that's a session on its own.
That's why I threw it all out there, to cover as much as we can.
I'll pick some of those questions and touch on them very quickly. I think fintech is still a nascent space in the region, although it's probably one of the biggest opportunities for any new companies or even VCs to invest in. When you look at Middle East and North Africa, you've got a region that has somewhat traditional payment infrastructure or traditional payment networks that are outdated. You also have a big percentage of people who don't have reach to financial services or the ability to transact seamlessly and electronically. So the opportunity is massive. When we're talking about regions such as Egypt, for example, where we've got 85% of adults unbanked, you're talking about a huge opportunity just in one country there. But the barrier to entry to fintech is very high, mainly because the stakes are high. I mean, you're dealing with money, right? Yeah, so the risks are very high. The rate of failure is obviously as well very high, but the opportunity, the upside is very huge. But the barrier to entry is challenging specifically in the region because of regulation as well. So the regulators, I think, regulators, banks, or incumbents when it comes to financial services have seriously to look into regulation and how to transform that to enable innovation in that space.
So how have you done that? How have you sort of positioned yourself vis-a-vis regulators?
Yeah, so we've intentionally wanted to set up in Dubai and UAE, mainly because UAE is one of the countries in the region that is open for business, that is pro-innovation, that always look into new technologies and enable that. You know, you see that with blockchain technology, with the Global Blockchain Council, Dubai Future Foundation, but also across the board with other tech VCs and startups enabling that ecosystem. So for us, it was setting up to, we've set out to set up the first Bitcoin digital currency exchange. We were self-regulating what we do from the beginning. We made sure that we understand what the regulators want, what they care about in our market in UAE, and also apply that operationally, compliance, et cetera, in our day-to-day work. But at the same time, have a clear mission to introduce Bitcoin and blockchain technology as a new innovation in payments through the products that we had. So obviously, you always want to make sure that you're driving innovation, but at the same time, being aware of the stakeholders in your market and how you could work with stakeholders to make sure that you're pushing the adoption of this technology is in the right way. And that was the strategy that we adopted since we set up here in UAE. At the same time, obviously, you have to make sure that you have the right protocols in terms of consumer protection in your own company and make sure that you're aware about compliance and the needs of the regulators. Because once you get regulated, which eventually you will, which is the case in any kind of new technology within financial services, you have to make sure that you have the right practices even before the regulator comes and regulate you. So that's the strategy that we've had. That's how we do it here in UAE, where we engage with regulators on continuous basis, periodic basis as well, to make sure
that's
the right regulations.
Just as a quick closing note, I think a trap that some investors might fall into, I'm not saying all, but some investors, including us to some extent, is we look at fintech as an industry. Which it is not. Fintech is, as I said earlier with regards to Bitcoin, fintech is an infrastructure. Fintech is an enabler. So when you're talking, marketplace lending, that's an enabler for your local corner store to fundraise and expand their business, or your dentist to buy a new machine. If you're talking about payments, you're talking about an infrastructure that allows e-commerce as an industry to be facilitated. So I think that's one, is when people start looking at fintech as an industry. The other thing about investors is they look at, when you start looking at things as an industry, you start looking, especially with tech, you start thinking disruption. And I think with fintech, you can't really talk disruption because it's necessary for you to build a company, as you said, with the incumbents, be they the regulator, bank, someone with liquidity, unlike, say, you know, an e-commerce company like Souk.com who are disrupting, you know, offline retail. They don't need them to do that. On the contrary. I think with fintech, it's the other way around. And because of those two reasons, I think you need a lot more upfront capital and a lot more patient capital, which is why you don't see much going on.
Yeah, definitely. I actually very strongly agree with you. Fintech is a long game as well. It's very different to run a Bitcoin company or a fintech company than running an e-commerce or an Uber, for example. So
right.
it's
not that that's easy. It's just that it's a different kind of.
It's
play.
a different space. It's a highly regulated space. So that's why you have to be.
That's right.
You have to work with the stakeholders, along with the stakeholders, rather than working on your own, because you eventually have to be regulated so you can start serving millions and hundreds of millions of people at that point. So regulation at this point is what's going to drive your growth.